Tell me, economic entities are governed by law and governed by the notion of responsibility. Do you think the entity of government should be considered as something co-resonant with economic entities, or whether they should be considered as political entities?
So make sure I understood your question. So your question is getting at the interrelationship between legal structures, how they evolve or were imposed, and what the relationship is to economic structures? Is that what you're getting at?
What is the power behind the entity of government? I understand what is the power behind economic entities, which is in fact consumption and the real consensus of the consumer. What is the either moral or economic reality behind the entity of government?
Oh, okay. I got it. So there's a great book that's coming out, and it's by Charles Calomiris and Stephen Haber, and it's called Fragile by Design, and it's about the history of the design of U.S. banking and regulatory, and it's exactly about this. So it's an expansion of an old theme, I guess, of Stigler and other people. Stigler used to call it regulatory capture, so you know, governments respond to lobbyists, and this is all about how actually it goes back. I'll just give you an example. I'll give you one little example. Deposit insurance, which is in the Glass-Steagall Act, which was signed by Franklin Roosevelt, I think in 1935. So one of the most a very important paper in economics was written it was published in 1978. So when people tell you economists completely missed the financial crisis, that's just wrong. There's this 1978 paper by Carrican and Wallace, where what they show, this was a time when the government started advocating, various people were advocating monetary deregulation. And what Carrican and Wallace showed in that paper is if you had deposit insurance, government-supplied deposit insurance, that was priced the way it is, like ill-priced, not risk-based pricing, and you deregulated financial intermediation, what you'd get is financial intermediaries would have the incentive to become as big as possible and as risky as possible. That's in the interest of their shareholders. And the outcome would be failure with probability 1, eventually, and the government would pay the bill. And Carrican and Wallace drew the conclusion that if you were going to deregulate, you had to reform or abandon deposit insurance and lender of last resort facilities. That paper's in '78 in the Journal of Business, and there's a related paper by Robert Merton. It is completely ignored. It was ignored even after the S&L crisis. So kind of go back in the history of that, and go back to when Glass-Steagall was passed. So Franklin Roosevelt, who was a pretty good economist and an empiricist, he was against deposit insurance and did not want to sign that clause of that bill. And the reason is there were state deposit insurance experiments in the teens and the 1920s. And what you found was states, and these were states with no branch banking. They were unit banks. They had pressured their state legislatures to put in deposit insurance, and what happened was the state banks became riskier, they tended to become bigger, and they tended to fail, putting money on the state taxpayers. And Franklin Roosevelt knew of the theory behind that, and he knew the data, and he didn't want to touch deposit insurance. He did not want it in Glass-Steagall. And Glass, the Senate didn't want it. And Steagall, as head of the House Banking Committee, he's a unit banker from Alabama. He said, you don't get the bill unless you get Roosevelt took the whole package and signed it. So right from the beginning,